The weak light filtering through the stained glass windows of the imposing white church seemed powerless to warm the frozen marble beneath Sophia's feet. At 8 years old, her world had shrunk to this cold aisle, the cloying scent of white lilies, and the weight of a silence that not even the mourner's whispers could break. In her small, trembling hands, a modest bouquet of daisies, her mother's favorite flower, was beginning to wilt from the heat of her anxiety. Her blue dress, the shade of a sky just before a storm, was the only splash of color in a sea of dark suits. Before her, the polished wooden casket held everything she loved most. Behind her, the presence of Beatrice, her stepmother, was like a chilling shadow that made her skin crawl. With her arms crossed and a steely gaze, she looked more like an event supervisor than a grieving widow. Her elegance was undeniable, but the hardness in her face twisted her beauty into something frightening. For Beatrice, mourning seemed to be just a performance, and Sophia was the flaw in the script. The little girl's tears, which fell without permission, were an affront to her rehearsed composure. Sophia's father, Richard, a man whose fortune was as vast as his absence, had not yet arrived. Preoccupied with business and the bureaucracy that loss demanded, he was miles away, immersed in phone calls and meetings, believing his daughter was being cared for. He had no idea that Sophia's only comfort was the memory of her mother's soft voice. Beatrice leaned in, her expensive perfume invading Sophia's space, and her voice, a hissing whisper that cut through the air, struck the child like a blow. "Stop crying this instant. She never even liked you. She always said you were a burden." The cruel, sharp phrase pierced Sophia's heart. The air left her lungs. She looked at the casket, doubt mingling with her grief. Could it be true? Her mother, who sang her to sleep and kissed her scraped knees, considered her a burden. The girl's weeping turned into a silent sob, an agony that shook her small body. A few guests in the nearby pews exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the injustice of those words, but no one dared to intervene. Richard's wealth commanded a fearful respect from everyone. With a thread of courage, Sophia took a step forward, wanting to touch the cold wood, to say goodbye one more time. But Beatrice grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "Stay put. Children only get in the way of serious moments," she said, gently pushing her into an isolated corner near a marble pillar. Alone and humiliated, Sophia knelt on the cold floor, clutching the flowers to her chest. She closed her eyes, and the tears began to fall again, hot and salty. In a whisper that was almost a prayer, she said, "I promise I'll be good, Mommy. I swear I will." Beatrice, watching her with contempt, marched over to her. Without a word, she snatched the flowers from the girl's hands with a sharp tug. The white petals scattered across the floor like tiny tears. "Enough of this scene. Your mother needs peace, not your theatrics." At that moment, a woman with white hair and an impeccable uniform, the family's housekeeper, approached with a glass of water. "The child needs to calm down, ma'am," she said, her voice trembling. Beatrice turned to the housekeeper, her face a mask of restrained fury. "Don't meddle in things that don't concern you, Helen, or the next person to leave here permanently will be you." Helen recoiled, her face pale and her lips trembling. Beatrice's threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The housekeeper, who had served the family for over 20 years and had seen Sophia born, felt a wave of helplessness and shame. Her silence was the price of her survival, but the cost to her soul felt far too high. She cast one last anguished look at the girl huddled on the floor, now stripped of even her simple flowers, and retreated into the shadows at the back of the church, becoming just another silent spectator to the veiled cruelty. Beatrice, satisfied with the maid's submission, smoothed the skirt of her designer dress and resumed her pose as the model widow. With a calculated sigh and a silk handkerchief delicately poised near her eyes, which remained dry, she turned to accept condolences from a neighboring couple. "She's so distraught, the poor thing," Beatrice said, her voice laced with a false compassion that made Helen's stomach turn. "The loss has left her. Unstable. I try to be firm, but it's a challenge." While the stepmother collected sympathies and praise for her strength, a photographer hired by Richard to document the service moved discreetly between the pews. His job was to capture the solemnity of the moment, the faces of friends and family, creating a posthumous memory that Richard himself, in his grief and absence, could not register. The photographer, a man experienced in covering high society events, knew that the most powerful images were not in the forced smiles or performative tears, but in the unguarded moments. It was then that his lens found the small figure of Sophia, kneeling and alone, her blue dress a stark contrast to the darkness around her. Intrigued by the scene, he adjusted his focus. In the exact instant he prepared to take the shot, Beatrice approached the girl again. Her expression had changed dramatically now that she was away from the majority of eyes. The grieving smile had given way to a scowl of impatience. She leaned down and, with her finger pointed, hissed something the photographer couldn't hear. But the image was eloquent. The tall, imposing woman, her accusing finger inches from the child's face, and the little girl, head bowed, seeming to shrink until she might disappear. The camera's click was nearly inaudible, a tiny sound that froze the tyranny of that moment forever. The photo, a forgotten record among hundreds of others, had captured the raw, unvarnished truth. Sophia didn't dare look up. She felt Beatrice's finger piercing the air near her face. "I told you to stop this drama. You're embarrassing your mother's memory." The words were whispered, but each syllable was a blow. The girl just nodded, the tears trapped in her throat. She looked down at her empty hands and felt an even greater emptiness in her chest. The world around her seemed a blur of muffled sounds and dancing shadows. The church organ began to play a somber melody, signaling the end of the service. People started to rise, the murmur of conversation growing as they headed for the exit. The pallbearers approached the casket, and a sudden panic seized Sophia. This was the last time, the last chance to be near her. With a desperate impulse, she scrambled to her feet and ran toward the casket, her trembling legs trying to reach their goal before it was too late. But once again, Beatrice was faster. She intercepted her, gripping her by the shoulders, her hand squeezing harder than necessary. "That's enough, Sophia," she snarled, her face inches from the girl's. At that moment, a distant cousin of Richard's, an elderly woman who had traveled from out of town, passed by and witnessed the scene. She saw the coldness in Beatrice's eyes, the way her fingers dug into the child's shoulder, and her own face, previously serene, tightened into an expression of sudden suspicion. The suspicion on the elderly cousin's face did not go unnoticed by Beatrice. In a split second, the fury in her eyes dissolved, replaced by a mask of weary concern. She loosened her grip on Sophia's shoulder, transforming the act of restraint into a protective embrace. "Oh, Cousin Clara, how good of you to come," Beatrice said, her voice melodic and smooth. "The little one is inconsolable. It's so difficult to know the right thing to do at a time like this." Clara, whose small, sharp eyes seemed to see right through the facade, offered a polite smile that didn't reach them. "Children feel things with a purity that we adults forget, Beatrice. Sometimes, all they need is to be held, not ordered around." The observation was subtle, but its implicit criticism hung in the air between them. Beatrice felt the sting, but maintained her composure, pulling Sophia tighter against her. The girl, in turn, felt like a rag doll, manipulated and displayed. Her stepmother's embrace was cold, an empty shell that offered no comfort. The short drive from the church to the cemetery was a silent blur for Sophia. Seated in the back of the luxury car, squeezed between the door and Beatrice's rigid body, she watched the streets of her upscale neighborhood pass by the window. The imposing mansions, the perfectly manicured lawns, It all seemed to belong to a distant world, a world where her mother still existed. At the cemetery, the air was thicker, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the quiet sorrow of dozens of families. The group of mourners gathered around the family mausoleum, a white marble structure that bore the names of generations. As the casket was positioned to be lowered, Beatrice guided Sophia to the edge of the group, near an old tree. "Stay here, darling. It's better if you don't see the details. I want to spare you more pain," she said, her voice sounding convincing to anyone nearby. From a distance, Helen, the housekeeper, watched everything, her heart tight in a knot of guilt and fear. Her eyes met Clara's, and for an instant, a spark of understanding passed between the two women, a silent alliance against the injustice they were witnessing. Two men in suits, business associates of Richard's, were talking in low voices. "It's a tragedy. Richard built an empire from nothing, a brilliant man on the stock market," one of them said. "All that net worth, the crypto investments, the overseas assets, and now he has to deal with this." The other side, glancing at Beatrice. "She seems to be handling the pressure well. Taking control of a cash flow of that magnitude is not for everyone." The conversation, floating on the air, reinforced the power Beatrice now held, the aura of untouchability that her husband's money afforded her. The priest began the final prayers, his words mixing with the sound of the wind in the leaves. Sophia fixed her eyes on the casket, her last connection to her mother about to disappear beneath the earth. The sound of the first shovels of dirt hitting the wood was a dull, final thud. A sob tore through Sophia's throat, a sharp, desperate sound that shattered the solemnity of the moment. "Mommy!" she screamed, her childish voice filled with an adult's pain. She struggled, trying to run, to break through the barrier of people and throw herself toward the hole in the ground as if she could stop the inevitable. Beatrice grabbed her hard, her face contorted with rage. "I told you to be quiet," she hissed, the venom in her voice audible to those closest. Before she could drag the girl away, a wrinkled but firm hand landed on her arm. Clara had moved closer, her serene face now a mask of determination. "Let the child go," she said, her voice low but carrying an authority that made the air vibrate and drew the shocked gazes of everyone around. The air around the mausoleum suddenly grew thin. Clara's command, spoken quietly but with the weight of an anvil, caused all whispers to cease. The gazes, once divided between the casket and the girl, now focused on Beatrice, whose hand still gripped Sophia's shoulder. For a moment, the stepmother's perfectly made-up face twisted into a mask of pure fury. Her dark eyes flashed, and for a second, she looked as if she might explode. But Beatrice was a master of self-control, a natural actress on the stage of high society. The rage was swallowed as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by an expression of offended and misunderstood benevolence. "Cousin Clara, with all due respect, you're misreading the situation," she said, her voice a thread of poisoned silk. "Sophia is distraught. I'm simply trying to calm her and keep her from hurting herself further." But Clara didn't move. Her eyes, wrinkled by decades of life, remained locked on Beatrice's, steady and fearless. "There are ways to calm a child, and force is not one of them. Let her go." Ignoring the stepmother completely, Clara knelt on the damp ground, heedless of her expensive dress, until her face was level with Sophia's. She held out a warm, wrinkled hand. "Come, dear, take my hand." Hesitantly, Sophia looked from Clara's impassive face to Beatrice's tense one. In that gentle offer, she felt the first wave of warmth and safety since her mother had gone. Slowly, she released the grip on her own dress and placed her hand in Clara's. The grasp was soft yet firm, a silent promise of protection. The scene was devastating to Beatrice's image. The child, rejecting her touch, was clinging to a distant relative. The murmurs started again, louder this time. "That poor little girl," one woman said. "She looks terrified." A gentleman beside her commented to his wife, And managing an inheritance like that and having to deal with a stepdaughter, it's not for everyone, but her coldness is unsettling. Beatrice felt the weight of their judgment. She was losing control of the narrative. With a forced smile that didn't hide the tightness of her jaw, she stood up. "Well, I think the exhaustion is getting to all of us. We should be getting home." She tried to take Sophia's other hand, but the girl flinched, pressing herself closer to Clara. The public rejection was the final straw. Beatrice took a step back, her dignity wounded. "As you wish." Clara helped Sophia to her feet, and hand in hand, they walked in silence out of the cemetery, leaving Beatrice behind, surrounded by curious and disapproving stares. As they parted near the gate, Clara hugged the little girl tightly. "Your mother was the strongest woman I ever knew," she whispered in Sophia's ear, making sure Beatrice, who was approaching with hard steps, couldn't hear. "You have her strength inside you. Never forget that." With one last warning glance at Beatrice, Clara got into a relative's car and drove away. Helen, the housekeeper, who had watched from a distance, felt a small flame of courage ignite in her chest. The tyrant was not invincible. In the car on the way to the mansion, the silence was a sheet of ice. Beatrice didn't say a word, her eyes fixed on the road. Her profile as hard as a statue. Sophia, huddled in the corner, felt the fear return, cold and familiar. When the car stopped in front of the estate's imposing gates, Beatrice finally turned. Her face was devoid of any emotion, which made it even more frightening. "That meddling old woman won't be here to protect you. From now on, you will do exactly as I say. Understood?" The word "understood" echoed inside the car, not as a question, but as the final verdict of a merciless judge. Sophia didn't answer. She just shrank further into the soft leather seat, wishing she could melt and disappear between the seams. The wrought iron gate hummed open, revealing the grand facade of the mansion she had once called home. Now, it looked like the entrance to an enemy fortress. Inside the house, the silence was even more oppressive. The late afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Indifferent to the tragedy that had taken root, every piece of art, every piece of designer furniture seemed to mock her with its cold, inanimate beauty. Beatrice slipped off her high heels with a sigh of relief, and the sound of her bare feet on the polished hardwood floor was the only noise to break the quiet. "Go to your room," she ordered, without looking at the girl. "And I don't want to hear a single sound. I have important matters to attend to." Matters that, Sophia knew, involved her father's vast fortune, the management of capital she could barely comprehend but whose lack of warmth she felt deeply. Sophia obeyed in silence, ascending the curved staircase like a small ghost. Her feet barely made a sound on the plush runner. In the upstairs hallway, she hesitated. Her bedroom door was to the right, but her heart pulled her to the left, toward her parents' suite. The sanctuary, where her mother's scent must still linger in the air. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she reached for the gold doorknob. Before her fingers could touch it, Beatrice's voice cut through the hall like a razor. "Don't even think about it." The stepmother was standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching her with hawk-like eyes. She ascended the steps slowly, each one echoing her newfound authority. Reaching the top, she stopped in front of the door and pulled a key from her pocket. "This room will be kept locked," she said, inserting the key into the lock and turning it twice. The metallic click was the most final sound Sophia had ever heard. "Tomorrow, the design team will be here to clear it out. One shouldn't live in the past. This house needs a new life." The tears Sophia had held back so forcefully finally overflowed. She ran into her own room and slammed the door. A futile act of rebellion that only emphasized her imprisonment. She threw herself onto the bed, burying her face in the pillow, and wept. She wept for her mother, for her absent father, and for herself. After a while, when the sobs subsided, she got up. She needed something, a piece of her mother that Beatrice couldn't lock away or throw out. She opened her nightstand drawer, rummaging through her childhood treasures, seashells, colored pencils, a broken yo-yo. And then, at the bottom, she found it, a small wooden music box, a gift from her last birthday. She opened it. The gentle melody of Claire de Lune began to play, the lullaby her mother sang to her every night. Clutching the little box as if it were a life raft, Sophia sat on the floor beside her bed and let the music fill the silence of her room and her heart. Suddenly, the sound of the phone ringing downstairs startled her. She heard Beatrice's footsteps, and then her voice, completely transformed. "Richard, my love, how wonderful to hear your voice." The sweetness in Beatrice's tone was nauseating. Sophia held her breath, her ear pressed to the door. The music box still playing softly in her trembling hands. The melody now seemed like a soundtrack to the cruelest of farces. "Oh, my love, I know it's hard, but you have to be strong. Think about the business, your responsibilities." Beatrice's voice, distilled into an artificial sweetness, flowed through the phone, each word carefully chosen to paint a picture of self-sacrifice and control. Huddled on the other side of the door, Sophia felt each syllable like a tiny needle in her skin. "I'm taking care of everything here, the house, the arrangements, and Sophia, of course, she's confused. Grief manifests in strange ways, you know. She barely speaks to me, refuses to eat. It's a phase, I'm sure. We just need to be patient." A silence followed, and Sophia could picture her father on the other end of the line, his face weary, his heart torn between the pain of loss and the guilt of absence. He was a man of numbers, of logic, a multi-millionaire who understood cash flow and stock market returns. But the complex algorithm of an 8-year-old's grief was a language he didn't speak. He was relying on Beatrice to be his translator. "No, darling, don't worry about any of that now," she continued. "I've spoken with the fund managers, assured them the estate is being monitored. Your wealth isn't going anywhere. The most important thing now is your emotional health and our little girls." The word "our" sounded profane to Sophia's ears. She gripped the music box so tightly the wooden edges dug into her palm. The delicate melody seemed a fragile spark of truth in an ocean of lies. Beatrice was constructing a narrative where she was the hero and Sophia was the problem child, the emotional complication in the midst of a transfer of power and assets. The girl felt the floor disappear from under her feet. How could her grief be described as a problem, a phase, an act of rebellion? It was all she had. It was the proof that her mother had existed, that she had been loved. Beatrice's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Yes, my love, I love you too. Get some rest. We'll be here waiting for you." The sound of the phone being placed in its cradle was followed by a heavy, expectant silence. Sophia froze, her ear still pressed to the wood. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that Beatrice had heard her. The sound of footsteps approaching the stairs confirmed her fear. They were slow, deliberate steps. The sound of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to run. Sophia scrambled back from the door, tripping over her own feet and falling to the floor. The door was flung open without warning. Beatrice stood in the threshold, her dark silhouette framed by the light from the hall. A thin, cold smile played on her lips. "It's very rude to eavesdrop, Sophia." Her eyes swept the room and landed immediately on the music box the girl was trying to hide behind her back. With the grace of a panther, Beatrice crossed the room and stood over her. Give me that." It wasn't a request. Sophia shook her head, tears welling up against her. "No, it was Mommy's." Beatrice's smile vanished. "That's precisely why I want it. You need to forget. Clinging to these things only prolongs your suffering." She bent down and, with cruel swiftness, snatched the box from Sophia's hands. The music stopped abruptly mid-note, the resulting silence more deafening than any scream. Beatrice stood up, holding the small object as if it were a piece of trash. "I'll keep this for you." When you learn to accept your new reality, perhaps you'll get it back. She turned to leave, leaving Sophia on the floor, stripped of her last, precious connection to her mother. The next day dawned grey and oppressive, a perfect reflection of Sophia's state of mind. The sound that woke her was not birdsong, but the scrape of furniture being moved and the unfamiliar voices of men echoing through the house. Beatrice had wasted no time. The design team was on site, carrying out their mission to erase every trace of the home's former mistress. Sophia stayed in bed, huddled under the covers, as if the darkness of her nest could protect her from the desecration happening just outside her door. Her mother's room, her sanctuary, was being violated, dismantled, emptied. Every thud, every shuffle of feet was a stab in her chest. Beatrice orchestrated it all with icy efficiency. Her phone pressed to her ear as she discussed paint colors and fabric swatches, while a lifetime of possessions was packed into cardboard boxes. She spoke of the importance of renovating the home's assets, of modernizing the estate to reflect a new phase, a phase where she was the sole queen. Hunger finally forced Sophia from her room. On tiptoe, she crept down the staircase, feeling like a stranger in her own home. In the living room, she saw her mother's favorite armchair, where they used to sit together and read stories, being covered in a white plastic sheet, ready for disposal. Her heart sank. Beatrice, spotting her, merely pointed toward the kitchen. "Helen left your breakfast on the table. Eat and go back to your room. I don't want a child underfoot while the professionals are working." The humiliation was a constant knot in her throat. She ate in silence under Beatrice's watchful eye, who took the opportunity to make another call. "Yes, darling, a complete overhaul. You have to invest in the house to maintain its value, don't you? Richard was always a genius with his investments in gold and the stock market, but the decorating taste was all his late wife's. I'm just adding my own personal touch." Sophia finished as quickly as she could and fled, not to her room, but to the garden. It was the only place that hadn't yet been touched, the refuge her mother had created with such love. She hid behind an old rose bush, tears streaming silently down her face as she pulled at small weeds, a chore she used to do with her mother. It was then that the soft purr of a car pulling up to the house made her hold her breath. It wasn't the rumble of the design team's trucks. It was the quiet, powerful engine of her father's car. Sophia's heart leapt, a mixture of hope and panic. He wasn't supposed to arrive until that evening. Richard got out of the car, his face etched with exhaustion and grief. A flight change had allowed him to return early, and he longed for his daughter's hug, for the familiar comfort he hoped to find. As he approached the front door, left ajar by the workers, he heard Beatrice's voice, loud and imperious, giving orders. He frowned. It was not the tone of a grieving woman. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was a chaos of plastic sheeting and boxes. "Beatrice," he called, his voice hoarse. His first need, however, was to find Sophia. He searched the ground floor and, not finding her, felt a tightness in his chest. It was then that he looked through the living room window and saw her, his little girl, huddled in the garden, her back to the house, trembling. He walked silently toward her, his heart breaking at the sight of her loneliness. "Sophia," he whispered. The girl whipped around, her eyes wide with panic, like a startled animal. When she recognized him, her expression didn't shift to relief, but to an even deeper fear, and she remained silent, paralyzed. At that exact moment, the back door opened and Beatrice appeared, the smile dying on her lips when she saw Richard. "My love, you're early." Her voice was pure shock. Richard looked from his daughter's terrified face to his wife's stunned one, and for the first time, a seed of real, terrible doubt began to sprout in his mind. The seed of doubt, once planted, began to germinate with alarming speed in the fertile soil of Richard's guilt and grief. The contrast between Beatrice's forced joy and Sophia's mute terror was a dissonance his logical mind couldn't ignore. His daughter's silence was more deafening than any accusation. "I decided to catch an earlier flight," he said, his voice neutral, but his eyes were fixed on Sophia. "I wanted to be with my daughter." Beatrice recovered her composure in a heartbeat, shock giving way to an expression of tender concern. "Oh, my love, you did the right thing. She needs you. I've tried everything, but she's completely shut down." She walked towards Sophia, her arms open in a maternal gesture. "See, sweetheart, Daddy's here now." But Sophia didn't move. If anything, she shrank back, her gaze darting between Richard and Beatrice, as if calculating which of them posed the greater threat. Richard saw the movement, subtle but undeniable. His daughter did not see Beatrice as a safe harbor. He knelt slowly so as not to startle her, his expensive suit coat creasing on the damp grass. "Princess," he called, using her childhood nickname, "it's okay. Daddy's home." The words had no effect. She remained mute, her large, dark eyes fixed on him, filled with a pain he couldn't decipher. It was more than grief. It was a deep, paralyzing fear. "Leave her, Richard," Beatrice intervened, her soft voice attempting to control the situation. "She's in shock. The psychologist said it's normal. We need to give her space." The mention of a psychologist Richard hadn't authorized and had never heard of was another alarm bell ringing in his head. He decided not to confront her there, in front of the child. He stood up and forced a weary smile. "Maybe you're right. I'll take my things upstairs." As he climbed the staircase, the chaos of the redecoration assaulted him with full force. Family portraits stacked in a corner, rugs rolled up, the smell of fresh paint. It felt less like a renovation and more like a purge. In the hallway, the door to his former bedroom was closed. Instinctively, he tried the handle, locked. "Beatrice!" he called, his voice sharper than he'd intended. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her expression overflowing with innocence. "What is it, dear? Why is our bedroom door locked?" "Oh, that," she said with a nervous laugh. "With the workers coming in and out, I thought it best to lock it to protect your valuables. The key is right here, in my purse." The excuse was plausible, but the feeling that something was wrong intensified. Later, at dinner, the tension was palpable. Beatrice chattered incessantly about her plans for the house, about how a new environment would help them all turn the page. Sophia barely touched her food, her gaze lost in her plate. Richard tried to make conversation with his daughter. "Remember our trip to the beach, Princess? We built that giant sandcastle." Sophia didn't react. "She needs discipline, Richard," Beatrice said in a confidential tone after the girl had asked to be excused. "She's using silence to manipulate you, to make you feel guilty." Her words were calculated, designed to prey on his greatest vulnerability, the guilt of his absence. The argument was perverse but effective. He felt torn. What if Beatrice was right? What if his own grief was blinding him to what was best for his daughter? Just then, the doorbell rang. It was a neighbor, a kind woman who had always been a friend of his late wife. She had come to return a serving dish she had borrowed. "Richard, my deepest sympathies," she said, her voice genuine. "I saw you'd arrived and just wanted to give you a hug. The scene yesterday at the funeral, it just broke my heart. That little girl, crying like that, being scolded in front of everyone, it was just awful." Richard's world stopped. Scolded? By whom? The neighbor suddenly looked uncomfortable, her gaze shifting to Beatrice, who had gone pale as a ghost behind him. "Well, she stammered, but she didn't need to say more. Richard's expression hardened. Something inside him, a protective denial, finally shattered. Doubt had morphed into a cold, cutting suspicion. The silence that fell in the mansion's entryway was thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. The neighbor, realizing the emotional earthquake her inadvertent words had caused, took a step back, the empty dish still in her hands. I apologize. Perhaps I misunderstood. It was such a difficult time for everyone," she murmured, eager to retreat from the line of fire. Richard, however, barely registered her departure. His gaze was locked on Beatrice, who was scrambling to reassemble her mask of composure. "How absurd," she exclaimed, forcing a laugh that sounded shrill and false. "People see what they want to see. I was comforting Sophia. Richard, she was hysterical. I had to be firm, for her own good." But the explanation, which might have sounded reasonable before, now rang hollow, devoid of all truth. The image of his daughter cowering in the garden, the terror in her eyes, superimposed itself over Beatrice's words, creating a devastating mental picture. His little girl wasn't being comforted. She was being controlled. He mechanically thanked the neighbor and closed the door, the sound echoing through the house like the clang of a cell door. "You're not going to believe some nosy neighbor over me, are you, Richard?" Beatrice began, her voice trembling slightly, a mixture of indignation and fear. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly into the living room, his mind working at a furious pace, re-evaluating every conversation, every gesture, every explanation she had given him over the past few days. It all now seemed part of a skillfully woven web of manipulation. His guilt was the main thread, and Beatrice was the patient spider at its center. He sank into one of the armchairs not yet covered in plastic, his head in his hands. "I need to be alone, Beatrice. Please." Seeing that her offensive strategy had failed, she changed tactics, approaching him with a hurt expression. "My love, your grief is clouding your judgment. I am here to help you, to help us get through this. Don't push me away." She placed a hand on his shoulder, but the touch, which might once have been comforting, now felt like a stranger's. He recoiled from it as if burned. The rejection was clear and unequivocal. Beatrice drew back, her hurt morphing into resentment. "Fine. If you'd rather believe outsiders..." She left the sentence hanging and went upstairs, her hard footsteps echoing her anger. Alone in the dimming room, Richard felt the full weight of his failure. How could he have been so blind? His empire, built on his ability to read people and predict market trends, felt like a cruel joke. He was a billionaire in dollars, but had failed at the most fundamental task, protecting his own child. A soft sound in the hallway made him look up. Helen, the housekeeper, was standing there, her face a mixture of fear and resolve. She held a small tray with a glass of water, but it was clear this was just an excuse. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice a whisper, "forgive me for my boldness, but Mrs. Clara, your cousin, she called this morning. She asked to speak with you urgently." The mention of Clara, the woman who had stood up to Beatrice at the cemetery, was like a beacon in the darkness. "Where's her number, Helen?" "I wrote it down, sir. It's in the kitchen." But she didn't move. She hesitated, her gaze darting toward the top of the stairs, as if afraid of being overheard. "Is there something else, Helen?" Richard asked, his voice gentle, encouraging. The housekeeper took a deep breath, her decision made. "There are things you need to know. Things I saw. Things I didn't have the courage to say." She held out a trembling hand, not with the tray, but with a small silver key she had pulled from her apron pocket. "It's the key to the study. There's a camera in there. One that Mrs. Beatrice doesn't know still works." The small silver key in Helen's outstretched hand seemed to weigh a ton. Richard looked from the metal object to the housekeeper's face, where decades of silent loyalty collided with the urgency of a tormented conscience. That key wasn't just for a door, it was the key to the truth, to the side of the story that had been meticulously hidden from him. He took it, the cold metal a shock against his skin. "Thank you, Helen," he said, his voice thick with a gratitude that went far beyond this single act. "You can go rest. I'll handle this." Helen nodded, a visible relief softening the lines of worry on her face. and retreated in silence, disappearing into the shadows of the house. Richard waited, his heart beating a heavy, steady rhythm against his ribs, until he heard Beatrice's bedroom door close upstairs. Only then did he move. With the stealth of a thief in his own home, he crossed the hall to the study door. It had been his late wife's room, a sacred space of work and creativity that Beatrice, curiously, had not yet touched in her renovation plans. The key turned in the lock with a soft click. He slipped inside, closing the door behind him, and was enveloped by darkness. Her scent was still there, a mix of old books, jasmine tea, and the subtle perfume she wore. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm him, but he pushed it down. Something else was more important now. He knew the camera Helen was talking about. It was a small security device, the size of a quarter, that he himself had installed years ago, hidden in a bookshelf to monitor a safe where they kept important documents and some jewelry. The main house security system had long since made it obsolete, and he had all but forgotten its existence. He sat at the desk, powered on the computer, and with slightly trembling fingers, accessed the old software. The interface was dated, but it worked. He found the recording files from the last 3 days. With a click of the mouse, the video window opened, showing a grainy but clear image of the study. He fast-forwarded through hours of stillness, the room empty and silent. Then, the door opened. Beatrice entered, dragging Sophia by the arm. Her face, away from Richard's eyes, was a mask of contempt. "I told you not to cry," she hissed. Sophia, sobbing, was clutching something in her hands. Richard zoomed in. It was the music box. His heart stopped. He watched, with his own eyes, the scene his daughter couldn't describe. He saw Beatrice rip the object from the girl's hands, the sound of the music cutting off abruptly. He saw her put the box in a desk drawer and lock it. "This stays here until you learn how to behave." The recording continued, showing the girl being dragged out of the study, her face awash in silent tears. The video ended. But for Richard, the scene replayed endlessly in his mind. Every detail burned into his conscience. The blood in his veins seemed to ice over and boil at the same time. A wave of pure, primal rage rose in his throat, an overwhelming urge to storm upstairs and confront the woman who had dared to inflict such cruelty on his daughter. He wanted to smash down her door, expose her wickedness, make her pay for every single tear. But then, the image of Sophia's terrified face in the garden superimposed itself over his fury. A burst of anger would only frighten her more. Beatrice, a master manipulator, would turn the situation against him, painting him as a man unhinged by grief. No, he would not give her that satisfaction. His revenge would not be an act of passion, but a calculated maneuver, as cold and precise as the stock market trades that built his fortune. His first objective was to retrieve the music box. It was more than a toy. It was a symbol, a fragment of his wife's soul. Sophia's last anchor. He tried the desk drawer, locked. The key, he assumed, was with Beatrice. He wouldn't ask for it. He searched through his late wife's keychain, an object he had religiously kept. There, among keys to vacation homes and safe deposit boxes, was a small brass key, nearly identical to the one he'd seen Beatrice use in the video. With a racing heart, he inserted it into the lock. It turned smoothly. The drawer slid open. Inside, nestled among contracts and bank statements detailing an enviable net worth, was the small wooden box. He picked it up, the object feeling strangely warm in his cold hands. He felt like an archaeologist rescuing a sacred artifact from a desecrated tomb. With the box in his possession, he climbed the stairs, each step an effort to remain calm. He stopped outside Sophia's door. It was slightly ajar. He peered inside. His little girl was asleep, but it was a restless sleep. Her small body was curled into a ball, her fists clenched near her face, as if she were fending off attacks even in her dreams. The sight shattered his heart into 1,000 pieces. Silently, he entered the room. The air was heavy with her unspoken pain. He knelt beside the bed and, with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, placed the music box on the nightstand, exactly where it used to be. It was a silent promise, a first step toward fixing what his neglect had allowed to be broken. He left the room, leaving the door as he had found it, and went to the guest bedroom. He lay down on the bed but did not sleep. All night, he stared at the ceiling, his mind forging a plan. His wealth, his businesses, his millions in assets and dividends, it all seemed meaningless, ridiculous, in the face of his failure as a father. The next morning, when he came down for breakfast, he was a different man. The grief was still there, but it was now tempered by a cold resolve. Beatrice was already at the table, reading a financial paper, a satisfied smile on her face. "Good morning, dear," she said. "Sleep better." "Like a stone," he lied, his voice calm and even. At that moment, Sophia appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide, clutching the music box to her chest. Her gaze met Richard's for a split second. Beatrice turned, and her smile froze when she saw the object. Her head whipped toward Richard, her eyes flashing a silent question. Richard simply picked up his coffee cup, looked at her over the rim, and said with terrifying calm, "Looks like you found your toy, princess. You must have dropped it under the bed." Richard's lie hung over the breakfast table, as transparent as the finest glass, yet as impenetrable as a wall of steel. Beatrice stared from the music box in Sophia's hands to Richard's impassive face, her mind working furiously to process the impossibility of the situation. She knew she had locked that drawer. She knew the key was safe in her purse. The only logical conclusion was that Richard had found it and opened it, but his calmness, his plausible deniability, twisted any accusation she could make into hysteria. To confront him would be to admit her own act of cruelty. She was trapped in her own web. A flash of fury crossed her eyes, quickly replaced by a tight smile. "Oh, wonderful, dear. I looked everywhere for that for you," she lied, her voice a pitch higher than usual. "I'm so glad you found it." Sophia didn't answer. She just hugged the box tighter and sat at the table, her gaze fixed on her empty plate. But for the first time in days, her shoulders weren't so slumped. A tiny spark of hope had been lit in her darkness. Breakfast was a lesson in Cold War. Beatrice tried to make small talk, chattering about the crypto market and the rising value of Bitcoin in an attempt to reconnect with Richard through the language they shared, wealth and capital. But he replied in monosyllables, his attention seemingly focused on the newspaper, though his eyes weren't reading the words. He was subtly watching Sophia's every move, every small hesitation. He noticed she ate a little more than she had in previous days. It was a small victory, but to him, it was worth more than any gain on the stock market. After breakfast, Richard announced his plans. "I'm going to spend the day with Sophia. I think we both need to get out of the house for a bit." Beatrice tried to intervene. "But darling, what about the decorators and the call with your European investment fund managers?" "Cancel them," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Nothing is more important than my daughter today." The word "my" was spoken with a subtle but powerful emphasis, drawing a clear line in the sand. He took Sophia to the park, the same one her mother used to take her to almost every day. He didn't press her to talk. He just sat on a bench, watching as she swung slowly, the music box resting in her lap. He bought her ice cream, her favorite flavor, and sat on the swing next to her. For a long time, the only sounds were the creaking of chains and the distant hum of traffic. "Daddy's so sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm sorry, I wasn't here. I should have been here." He didn't turn to look at her, keeping his eyes on the horizon. A small hand, still sticky from ice cream, rested on his. Sophia said nothing, but the touch was an absolution. a first step toward mending the bridge that had broken between them. They spent the whole afternoon together, rebuilding their connection through small gestures. He pushed her on the swing, higher and higher, and for the first time, he heard the faint sound of a small laugh. The sound hit him with the force of a wave, washing away a little of his guilt. When they returned home in the late afternoon, the mood between them was visibly lighter. But as they entered the mansion, they were met by a stony-faced Beatrice. "Richard, I need to talk to you, alone." She led him into the study, the same room where he had discovered the truth the night before. "What is wrong with you?" she demanded as soon as the door was closed. "You're acting strangely. You're undermining my authority with the child." Richard looked at her with a calmness that disarmed her. "No, Beatrice, I'm not undermining your authority. I'm taking it back. This is my house, this is my daughter, and things are going to change." Before she could respond, he opened the now unlocked desk drawer and placed a small device on the polished wood, a flash drive. "And the first change is that we're going to watch a little movie together." The flash drive lying on the polished desk was small, almost insignificant, but to Beatrice, it seemed to take on the proportions of a ticking bomb. Her face, which moments before had been taut with anger, suddenly lost all its color. "A movie, Richard. I don't have time for games. We have serious matters to discuss. Our future, the management of the estate." Her voice, normally so controlled, faltered, betraying the panic that was beginning to bubble beneath the surface. Richard remained silent, his steady, unwavering gaze stripping her bare. He didn't need to shout. His calm was his most potent weapon, a stillness that promised a devastating storm. He picked up the remote for the large flat-screen television mounted on the opposite wall, a device they usually use to track stock market fluctuations in real time. With a click, the screen came to life, not with stock tickers and dollar signs, but with the security system's interface. Beatrice held her breath. Her eyes darted to the bookshelf, to the small, almost invisible black dot she had never noticed. The camera. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find an out, a denial, a way to twist reality in her favor. But there was no escape. The truth was right there, stored on a tiny silicon chip. "I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish with this," she began, trying one last defiant gambit. "This is an invasion of privacy. I could sue you for this." Richard arched an eyebrow, a minimal gesture that conveyed absolute contempt. "Sue me, Beatrice, please." Just imagine the headlines. "Billionaire's widow sues husband for discovering abuse of orphaned daughter." It would be fascinating to see how your high society friends would react. The venom in his voice was subtle, but lethal. He was using her greatest weakness, her obsession with image and social status, against her. Beatrice's face contorted into a mask of impotent hatred. She was cornered, her fortress of lies crumbling brick by brick. With another click of the remote, Richard played the video. The scene he had already watched in private now unfolded in high definition on the large screen. Beatrice dragging Sophia, her cruel words echoing through the high-fidelity sound system, the sound of the little girl's sobs, the theft of the music box. Watching the scene a second time did not lessen its impact. On the contrary, Richard's fury solidified, turning from a liquid heat into a blade of ice. He let the video play to the end. The silence that followed was filled only by Beatrice's ragged breathing. "Richard, Her voice was a hoarse whisper. "I can explain. I was under so much stress. The grief, it made me do things that—" "No," he cut her off, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare use grief as an excuse. Don't you dare tarnish her memory with your lies." He stood up, walking slowly to the window, his back to her. "You know, I was up all night thinking. I thought about calling the police, about exposing you publicly. I thought about destroying you in the same way you tried to destroy my daughter's innocence." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But that would create a scandal. And Sophia has been through enough. She doesn't deserve to have her pain splashed across the newspapers. He turned to face her, and the coldness in his eyes made her take a step back. So, here's what you're going to do. You're going to pack your things. You will leave this house tonight, and you will never speak to me or my daughter again. Your share from the prenuptial agreement will be wired to your account. Consider it the price for your silence and your disappearance. That is my final offer. Richard's offer was a dull, final blow. Beatrice stared at him, her mouth half open, shock giving way to outraged disbelief. The prenup, a document she had signed years ago. Considering it a mere formality, a piece of paper her charm and influence would eventually render irrelevant. In her mind, she already saw herself as the undisputed heir to his empire, the manager of a net worth that would guarantee power and luxury for generations. The idea of being dismissed with a fixed sum, however large, was an insult, a demotion. It was being reduced from a queen to a mere well-compensated ex-wife. "You're joking," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed, you think you can just get rid of me with money?" Richard didn't flinch. "I don't think. I know. And what exactly did you sacrifice, Beatrice? Your conscience, your humanity." He picked up his phone and made a call. "Arthur, prepare the wire transfer to Beatrice's account. The full amount stipulated in the agreement." "Yes." "Effective immediately." He hung up and looked back at her, his eyes empty of all emotion. "The cash flow has been initiated. Your sacrifices have been duly compensated. Now get out." The finality in his voice was terrifying. Beatrice realized there was no negotiation, no room for her usual manipulations. He had cornered her, not with rage, but with the same cold, ruthless logic he used to dismantle competing companies. She was just another toxic asset to be liquidated from his portfolio. Her face twisted into a sneer of pure contempt. "You will regret this, Richard. You'll be all alone with that spoiled, troubled little girl. You'll see how she'll drain your life, your time, your resources. And I'll be laughing, watching you sink." Her words were venomous, designed to wound, to exploit his guilt one last time. But Richard was now immune. The armor of truth protected him. That's enough, Beatrice. Stop projecting your own failings onto others. The only one sinking here is you, in your own emptiness." He opened the study door. "Helen will help you with your bags. I want you off this property in 1 hour." Without another word, he walked out, leaving her alone with her defeat. Richard found Sophia sitting on the top step of the main staircase. She had heard the voices, not the words, but the tension, the restrained anger. Her face was pale and frightened. He sat down beside her, the silence enveloping them. He didn't need to explain the sordid details. All she needed to know was that she was safe. "Beatrice is leaving, princess," he said, his voice soft. "She's not coming back." Sophia didn't react at first. She just kept looking at her hands. Then she looked up, and for the first time since the funeral, her voice was clear, without the tremor of fear. "Is it because of me?" The question, laden with a guilt no child should ever feel, hit Richard with the force of a punch. He pulled her into a hug, holding her tight against his chest, trying to transfer all of his strength, all of his love, into her small body. "No, my love, never. It was never because of you," he whispered, his face buried in her hair. "It was because of me, because I didn't protect you. But that's over now, I promise. I will never let anyone hurt you again." He felt her shoulders relax in his embrace, a sigh escaping her lips. It was the sound of relief, of a burden too heavy to carry being set down. Downstairs, the sound of suitcases being dragged across the marble floor marked the end of a dark chapter and the uncertain beginning of a new one. In the days that followed Beatrice's departure, the mansion seemed to breathe again. The silence, once oppressive and filled with fear, gradually became serene, an empty space waiting to be filled with new sounds, new memories. Richard cancelled all the redecorating plans, dismissing the crews and leaving the house exactly as his late wife had designed it. Every object, every painting, every book on the shelf was a silent testament to the love that had lived there, and he realized that erasing those memories wasn't a way of moving on, but a way of erasing his own history. His absolute priority became Sophia. He delegated the day-to-day management of his businesses and investments to a trusted team, trading boardrooms and stock tickers for the simple, profound task of being a father, the fortune, the net worth, the dividends. It all seemed secondary now, mere numbers on a balance sheet compared to the incalculable value of his daughter's smile. They started with small steps. Richard discovered, with a pang of shame, that he didn't know the simplest things about Sophia's routine. He didn't know her favorite cereal, which cartoon she watched before bed, or that she liked her sandwiches cut diagonally, never straight across. Helen, with her quiet wisdom, became his guide, teaching him how to navigate the world of his own child. Together, the three of them began to rebuild the notion of home. Richard and Sophia spent hours in the garden, not pulling weeds, but planting new flowers. They planted daisies, her mother's favorite, and Sophia told Richard how each one represented a happy memory. He listened, absorbing every word, his heart aching for the time he'd lost, but filling with gratitude for the chance to start over. One afternoon, as they were watering the new plants, Sophia suddenly grew serious. "Daddy, did Mommy go away because I was bad?" she asked, the same cruel doubt planted by Beatrice resurfacing. Richard put down the watering can and knelt in front of her. Taking her small hands in his, he looked her in the eye, making sure she felt the truth in his words. "Mommy didn't go away, Princess. Her body got very, very sick and tired, and it needed to rest. But her love is right here," he said, placing a hand over her heart. "And it's here," he added, pointing to the sun shining above them. "And in every single one of these flowers, she would never, ever leave you." Slowly, joy began to return to the house. In small, precious moments, Richard found his wife's cookbooks and, despite being a disaster in the kitchen, tried to make the pancakes Sophia loved so much. The first attempt burned, the second was raw, but the third, while oddly shaped, was edible. Sophia laughed, a genuine bell-like laugh that echoed through the kitchen, and to Richard, it was the most beautiful melody in the world. He realized that his presence was the most profitable investment he would ever make. Money could buy comfort, security, luxury, but it couldn't buy back time, nor could it heal a broken heart. That was a job that required patience, presence, and unconditional love. One rainy evening, he found Sophia in the old study, sitting in her mother's chair, flipping through one of her photo albums. Instead of sending her to bed, he sat on the floor beside her, and they spent hours looking at the photos together. He told her stories of how he met her mother, of their travels, of the day she was born, and Sophia, in turn, shared her own memories, the little things only she knew. In that study, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, they didn't feel sadness, but a deep, warm connection, the certainty that the love that bound them was a treasure no amount of malice could ever steal. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation in the mansion and its inhabitants was remarkable. Sophia's laughter once again echoed through the halls, and the shadow of fear in her eyes was gradually replaced by a glow of confidence and safety. Richard, for his part, discovered a new definition of success. It was no longer measured by rising stocks or new acquisitions, but by the progress in the garden, the perfection of a pancake, or the peace on his daughter's face as she slept. Still, he knew that complete healing required one final step, a symbolic act to close the circle of pain where it had all begun. On a sunny Sunday morning, he took Sophia's hand. "Princess, "What do you think about visiting Mommy today? We could bring her some new flowers from our garden." Sophia hesitated for a moment, a brief shadow crossing her face. The cemetery was a place of painful memories. But then she looked at her father, at the quiet strength in his gaze, and nodded with a small smile. "Yes, I think she'd like that." Together, they picked the most beautiful bouquet of daisies the garden had to offer. The drive to the cemetery was quiet, but it was a comfortable, shared silence. When they arrived at the white marble mausoleum, the place no longer seemed so frightening. The sun was shining, and a gentle breeze made the leaves on the trees dance. Richard knelt and cleared away a few leaves that had fallen on the headstone, his gesture reverent and full of love. Sophia, holding the bouquet in both hands, stepped forward and placed the flowers gently on the cool stone. She stood there for a moment, her head bowed, her lips moving in an inaudible whisper. Richard gave her space, his heart overflowing with a protective love. "Daddy," she said, turning to him, her eyes clear and serene. "She can rest in peace now." "Can't she? Because you're here to take care of me." The simplicity and depth of her statement hit Richard with overwhelming force. That was it. That was all that mattered. His presence was the guarantee of his wife's peace, the continuation of her love. "Yes, Princess," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here, and I'm never leaving your side again." The drive home was different. It felt as though an invisible weight had been lifted from both their shoulders. When they arrived, Richard found an envelope in the mail. It was from the photographer he had hired for the funeral, a note apologizing for the delay, accompanied by a flash drive with all the images from that day. Later, alone in his study, Richard opened the files, not out of masochism, but from a need to close the door on the past for good. He clicked quickly through the images of guests, of flower arrangements, until one photo made him stop. It was the image he never knew existed. Beatrice, her finger pointed, her expression one of pure cruelty, and Sophia, cowering, the personification of terrorized innocence, the irrefutable proof of everything. He looked at the photo for a long time, not with anger, but with a cold clarity. He dragged the file to the trash and emptied it, deleting it forever. He didn't need that proof anymore. His living proof was in the next room, laughing at a cartoon. His focus was not on revenge, but on building a future. That night, inspired, he began to sketch out an idea. He took a piece of paper and wrote at the top, "The Sophia Foundation, in memory of an eternal love." The foundation would be dedicated to helping children who, like his daughter, had suffered emotional trauma, providing support, therapy, and above all, a safe harbor. His vast estate, his fortune, would finally have a purpose greater than mere accumulation. It would be transformed into hope, into healing. It would be his wife's legacy of love, blossoming and helping others, just like the daisies in their garden. On a calm evening, months later, Richard and Sophia walked hand in hand to the white church where it all began. The golden light of the setting sun streamed through the stained glass windows. The same light that had once seemed so cold now bathed the interior in a warm, welcoming glow. No one else was there, just them and the peaceful silence of the sacred place. Sophia, holding a single white daisy, walked to the altar and laid it gently on the linen cloth. She turned to her father, her face illuminated by a serenity that was wise beyond her 8 years. "I know now, Daddy," she whispered, her voice echoing softly in the empty nave. "My mommy always loved me." Richard felt tears well in his eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, of healing. He knelt, embracing his daughter, his miracle, his most precious asset. "Yes, she did," he answered, his voice trembling. "And I will never let anyone hurt you again." The setting sun wrapped them both in a golden embrace, the promise of a new dawn filling their hearts. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom, but in the restoration of innocence. The house, once a stage for pain, had become a home again, and love, tested by grief and malice, had proven to be the most resilient force of all.